Coming up, census numbers are in, and now we see how those population numbers are going to impact Indian country when it comes to voting. Plus, running away from boarding school, one young man retraces the steps his great-grandfather took in 1913 when he fled the Stewart Indian School in Nevada. I'm Patty Talahongva. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from Indian country today.
Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Talahongva. Voting access should be more equitable for Native communities. That's the goal of a new piece of legislation introduced in the U.S. Congress. The Native American Voting Rights Act of 2021 includes key measures to combat challenges Native people have to vote. It authorizes tribal ID cards to be used at polling locations and allows tribes to specify the number of registration sites, ballot boxes, and polling places. The legislation is sponsored by Native Congress members Sharice Davids and Tom Cole in the House of Representatives. Davids released a statement about barriers American Indians face when many go to vote. She cited long distance to travel to vote, sporadic operating hours at polling places, and a lack of voter education. Voting is the very foundation of our democracy, yet Native voters face repeated barriers at the ballot box. This bill further fulfills our federal trust responsibility to protect and promote Native Americans' exercise of their constitutionally guaranteed right to vote. The bill also provides $10 million for states to set up Native voting task forces to address other issues. A state plan in Texas to monetize cultural sites where Indigenous people were murdered and displaced is sparking a backlash. The Guardian reports the state, which exterminated or forcibly moved most of the Indigenous people in the region, now wants to cash in on them. A state agency appointed by Governor Greg Abbott is trying to make money to attract tourists to Indigenous historical and cultural sites. This comes at a time when state lawmakers are supporting legislation that could stop Indigenous history being taught in schools. Valerie Grusing is the executive director of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. She says the state is going to meet with tribes.
I hope that this can be an opening of the door, and I hope that it can be the beginning of dialogue between the THC, between the state, and between tribes, whether they were removed or whether they still have a presence on the landscape.
Still, the Texas Historical Commission is hoping to mine tribal nations for significant sites to expand the state's multi-billion-dollar tourism program. A new initiative based in New York is supporting Indigenous people with space and thousands of dollars in fellowship money. The Forge Project is a new nonprofit supporting Indigenous communities and leaders working in the arts, food sovereignty, and Native languages. Its first cohort of 4 Indigenous people will be given the time and space to work on their projects, in addition to $25,000. The fellowship, which runs annually, is based in Columbia County, New York, at a house designed by Chinese artist and activist Ai Weiwei. Heather Briegel is the director of education for the project. Briegel is hopeful the project can make a difference in the Indigenous community by raising their voices.
One of the major outcomes that we're hoping for and looking for is raising the awareness of these people in Indian country who are doing this great work, who are boots on the ground, who are working in climate justice, the importance of bringing back language, visual art that encompasses Indigenous communities.
The 4 Indigenous fellows include an architect, a filmmaker, ecologist, and a language preservation activist. An Australian woman is helping Indigenous communities across the state of Queensland receive ancient weaving practices. With every leaf, vine, and fiber she harvests from her backyard, Felicity Chapman feels closer to her culture. After recovering from a brain bleed 4 years ago, she decided to dig deeper into her Indigenous culture. She's Wiradjuri and says learning how to weave and dye fiber is helping her feel connected to her culture. She now shares her passion with other people.
Most of us now tend to live away from the countries that we were born on, and weaving is a really powerful way of actually transporting you home.
Chapman has been invited to run dozens of workshops around the Queensland area. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Patty Thalahungva. It's a process called redistricting that happens every 10 years. And coming up, we'll learn about the power of the Native vote in future election cycles.
And later, we'll hear from Q Stevens, who retraced the steps of his grandfather when he ran away from Stewart Indian School. The 2020 election showed the power of the Native vote. In the presidential election, places with high Native vote counts like Arizona stunned the country by turning the state from red to blue. Now, around the country, including some backyards, there's a redrawing of the boundary lines in district. It's a process that happens every 10 years following the collection of the U.S. Census. It's based on population numbers, and the district you live in may be redrawn to mean you're represented by a different state legislator, or your state could even create a whole new seat in Congress. Here to talk about the national impact of redistricting in Indian country is Ahtza Dawn Chavez, who is the executive director of the Native American Voters Alliance and its education project. Welcome, Ahtza.
Thank you.
So the big picture is there are a lot of changes going on redistricting right now.
Yes, sir, there are. In the state of New Mexico, we are leading the Native Redistricting Coalition, which is meeting with all of the 23 state recognized tribal nations in the state, as well as working with the All Pueblo Council of Governors, state leaders, and advocates across the state to make sure that we have fair and accurate maps that are representative of the population and the needs of our tribal nations.
And even within that, there's a lot of strategy involved, because in some of the districts, it's, do you want a district that's all Native, or do you want to split that vote and have influence in other elections? How do people resolve those really thorny issues?
Well, in the state of New Mexico, it's a little more complicated in the sense that we have 23 independent sovereign nations. And so really trying to make sure that we are including them in the conversation, reaching out to them, making sure that all of these bodies that are already created, 5 Sandoval, 8 Northern, APCG, the Navajo Nation, the Apache nations, that they all are included and that they're brought to the table, because they are sovereign nations. We're not able to say, hey, here's the boundaries that we like, why don't you just take them? We really need to get that information and their priorities from them. So for an example, Zuni Pueblo is split into congressional districts. So having the conversation with them and letting them answer for us, have they seen positive outcomes from being in 2 districts? Do they want to be in 1 district? And then there are a lot of different things like prison populations and changes in population numbers that need to be taken into account as we move forward in this process.
You think about Arizona and New Mexico as 2 states with a very significant Native population, and yet there really has never been any representation in Congress of that population.
Right. In the state of New Mexico, the recent early numbers from the 2020 census are showing that there was a potential 10% increase in the overall Native American population. From the 2010 numbers, the approximate number of Native Americans in the state of New Mexico was around 10%. So when you take into account that increase, that means that we're potentially 12 to 14% of the population, meaning that we really should have representation that is similar to the level of population that we have in the States. In Arizona, it's been much, much harder for tribes to advocate for that representation. But as we see, our local hero and auntie, Deb Haaland, as she was able to represent for the state of New Mexico, now she's able to represent for the whole country on behalf of Native Americans. And we can see the differences in the policy as we move forward when we have people who not only uphold but believe in our culture and ways and our need to preserve things like the environment or to uphold the tenets of the Voting Rights Act.
Each state comes up with its own plan for redistricting, and some states are outright partisan, and other states have independent commissions that look at the issue. Do we see that impact in Indian country?
We do. And in the state of New Mexico, this past legislative session in 2021, we really did try to advocate for a citizens redistricting committee. And so the state of New Mexico now has this independent citizen redistricting committee. There were 7 members, and of the 69 applicants, unfortunately, 6 of those 7 members are white or Hispanic males, and only one of those members is actually a female. So it's not necessarily representative of the state as of yet, but it's a step in the right direction. 3 of those 69 applicants were actually Native American women who are very, very educated and would have been really great appointments, excuse me. However, those 3 women are still working within the Native Redistricting Coalition as we move forward these efforts. So it's not that they stepped out of the game, they just unfortunately were not appointed to this particular committee.
Every once in a while, a lot of us will get an email that says, come testify before the commission. How important is that?
It is extremely important. So this past Saturday, the CRC had a meeting at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. And the large majority of that meeting was tribal leaders and tribal advocates kind of putting into context the need for representation and the need for the CRC to take the requests and the maps and the lines that tribal leaders were putting forward seriously and saying that this was our sovereign right, and it really needed to be more of a government to government process. And so you really saw that because tribal leaders took the time out on a Saturday and a Sunday to advocate for their communities, that the CRC took note of their requests.
You mentioned government, and I'm thinking around the world, tribal nations actually have more say in legislatures than they do in the United States. For example, in New Zealand, there are seats reserved for the indigenous people. Should we be looking at a bigger process like that in this country?
I think that we really do need to take that into consideration. And I know, certain laws have said that we should have representation within the United States, and that we should be held on a similar level in terms of when we make a request. I know right now, tribal consultation is something that people throw around all the time, but what really resonates with tribal communities are really sitting down and having those really hard to have conversations. We can't start those conversations, well, okay, here it's 2020 or 2021, and this is what we need to do moving forward. We really have to be able to put those requests and needs and the history and context so that people understand why we're making the requests that we are and why our requests are so important, and they need to be upheld. Things like tribal sovereignty and the right to choose who we would like to have in these positions are really crucial to the policy and the day-to-day needs of working Native families.
Well, and you see that on the ground because so many of the districts are rural in nature, and the rural voters often have a very different agenda than tribal governments and tribal citizens.
That's very, very true. One of the main things that, will continue to be an issue are water rights, right? A lot of tribes in the state of New Mexico, based on how the Pueblos came to be, have issues with tribal water. And you have things like, the new cannabis bill that's going through. So there are issues that need to be advocated upon. Right of ways are another issue that come into play. But without the representation and without people in these seats where they'll listen to our needs and our requests, then we end up disenfranchising ourselves and reducing our own power and our ability to advocate for ourselves and for our community members.
Thank you so much, Ahtza. And we'll keep an eye on this redistricting process as it unfolds.
Thank you.
There's been a lot of news about mass graves found near residential schools in Canada. And one young cross-country runner read those stories and thought of his own great-grandfather. The Canadian residential schools were modeled after the U.S. government-run boarding schools that started in the late 1800s. Many of these schools were overcrowded, which led to disease spreading. They also had poor nutrition. Koo Stevens' great-grandfather, Frank Quinn, attended the Stewart Indian School in 1913. He ran away 3 times. After the news broke in Canada, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland ordered an investigation into the boarding schools operated by the United States government. In the midst of all this news, Koo decided to reenact his great-grandfather's escape. He did that this past weekend. Caitlin Anawa-Boysell has the story.
I'm gonna put on my socks before I go over there.
Koo Stevens is 17 years old and the descendant of a boarding school survivor. His family organized a 2-day run to remember those who did or didn't make it home.
I've never been one for retying shoes over and over. So to anybody else, you just come here and you see these old buildings. You see the cool rocks on the walls and the old window panes. You can tell it's an old place. But to me, it's, what happened here. And it's a lot different to just anybody else coming here and visiting. It's a lot more personal.
At just 8 years old, Koo's great-grandfather broke out of the Stewart Indian School to escape the cruel and harsh conditions. Now Koo is retracing his great-grandfather's escape.
Because as an 8-year-old to cross 50 miles over these hills, that's a feat.
We know from our archives that students typically were not in the best health because they weren't fed well. We know that clothing was often an issue. They were given a uniform and typically hand-me-down shoes that were left over from U.S. soldiers. So definitely not the clothing and nor any kind of equipment that you would think anyone, a healthy adult, would need, much less an 8-year-old. But again, we have firsthand accounts of these types of very heroic, just absolutely courageous attempts by these young people to get back to their families.
But Koo's great-grandfather wasn't the only one who attempted to run away.
To federal representatives, people that were paid by Uncle Sam to round up students, to take them to very far away institutions for boarding school. Also, bounties were put out for young Indian children.
Often, the federal government would pay people to find runaways. The scene was happening at dozens of other government-run boarding schools for Native children. Koo's journey started at the Stewart Indian School and ended at the Yerington Paiute tribe. Koo is a cross-country runner at his high school. His great-grandfather was just 8 when he ran the same path to get home. That journey took them both uphill. Koo ran during the day. His family says it's more likely his great-grandfather, Frank, ran at night to avoid being seen. Koo ended his journey with a celebration from friends and family. He says he even felt his ancestors on his feet.
It didn't really hit me until the end about what I was doing. Running down that hill and, seeing my valley and seeing my home and just my people's land out here. Oh man, goosebumps all the way down.
And he knows what he would say to his great-grandfather if he was here today.
Thanks for getting me this far, because, without him and the decisions he would have made, to even run away from here, if he didn't, I couldn't even be here. Thanks for being a good man and wanting to be with your family and wanting to support them in any way that you could, because that's family, You do anything for them. We both did it.
In Nevada.
Yeah, thanks for coming again.
Caitlin Anawa Boycell, Indian Country Today.
Ku and his family say they want to make this run an annual race. We'll be right back. A guy in a bear suit walks through the Navajo Nation, and it's making quite an impression. Meet Bear Son, a Japanese anime-style teddy bear created by Jesse Laros. He's raising money for various charities that center on mental health, autism, cancer, disabled community, and the environment. Noel Smith of the Farmington Daily Times has been following this story. Welcome, Noel.
Oh, yate, Mark.
So first off, where did you meet Bear Son?
I met Bear Son and got to talk to him when he made a stop in Window Rock, Arizona, which is the capital of the Navajo Nation. And yeah.
Why do you think he's been such a hit?
I think it's because of one, the suit. The suit is a big appeal. He looks very cute in it, and also the various charities that he is walking for and the reasons. I think they resonate across the Navajo Nation as far as these issues that we know exist in our communities, but we don't necessarily talk about publicly. And so he's kind of creating that space for that discussion to happen.
And what are some of the stories you've heard covering him?
When I was talking to a group, so he basically says that he prefers to kind of walk by himself, but if people want to walk with him, that's cool. Just ask him and he'll say yes or no. But he ended up getting like a few walkers to go with him, and a group that actually went from Greasewood, Arizona to Window Rock with him. And so I talked to a couple of those walkers, and they said that they were attracted to him because of the reasons why he was walking, and then also they were just concerned about his safety and making sure that his journey across the Navajo Nation was a safe one, and just kind of to give him, I guess, a little bit of some support as he moves along. And in one instance, one walker said that her son is about the same age as Jesse, who is Bear Son. And she was like, if my son took this endeavor upon himself to do, I would hope that people will respond in the same manner as far as, wanting to support him and keep him safe and just be with him. And so a lot of these folks on the Navajo Nation are also, just kind of adopting them as their own. And I see a lot of Navajos calling him Shiyash, which is like my little one in our language.
Well, and also the bear has an important role in Navajo stories, does it?
It does, and I would elaborate on it, but I'm not like an authority on it, so I don't want to say something wrong. But I know ceremonial-wise, there are times where you can call the bear forward, but I don't know the specifics on those. But I know as far as when you go out into the woods, you say certain songs, you say certain prayers to protect yourself. And if you come across a bear, you'll address them as a grandfather, so Che, and talk to them and just let them go on their way. You don't interrupt their path. You respect them as they travel forward.
Has there, I mean, this late summer and there's heat and rain. What are some of the challenges of this walk that might not have been in first mind?
Definitely him being in that bear suit. I've read online that there's padding in it, but he does carry he wears what they call a camel pack. So it's like a little portable water container that he has strapped to him like a backpack. And he refills that on his way. And there was concern about whether he was going to get dehydrated. So a lot of people kept bringing like bottles of water, Gatorade, things for him to drink. And he's mentioned a lot that he enjoys Starbucks. And so he'll say like what his favorite drink is. And people will show up at where he's walking and give him Starbucks. And they're actually really excited when they meet him. And they're like, I gave Bear Son Starbucks today.
The Adventures of Bear Son.
Yeah, and he's surprised where they pop up with Starbucks. And he's like, where did you get Starbucks?
Thank you so much, Noel.
Thank you.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news, go to IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Mark Trahant.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing rock. This is Indian Country Today.